On a cold morning in April of 1984, Emmett Kohl knelt in the dirt at the edge of his best quarter section, out past the mailbox on a gravel road 9 miles south of Broken Bow, Nebraska, and instead of planting corn, he began planting trees, little bare-root seedlings no taller than a soup spoon, green ash and eastern red cedar, and a run of caragana, tucked one by one into a shallow furrow along the north fence line, where the ground was flat and open and worth good money in a good year. He worked slow. He worked all morning, a man in his 50s on his knees in the wind, setting out a row of sticks on land that was supposed to be growing something that paid. By noon, half of Custer County had driven past to look. Buck Terrell, who farmed the place east of him, slowed his pickup to a crawl and rolled the window down and just grinned and didn't say a word, because there wasn't a word for it. Trees on cropland. In the worst farm economy since the Dust Bowl, with interest running high enough to bury a man, Emmett Kohl was taking his best acres out of production to plant a windbreak that wouldn't stand taller than a fence post for 10 years. Down at the First State Bank in town, when word got around, they laughed. Not cruel, exactly. Just the tired laugh of men who've watched good farmers make bad decisions. Trees don't make a land payment. They were about to find out otherwise. If stories of patience, stubborn faith, and the quiet wisdom of old men mean something to you, take a second and subscribe, and join our farming family here. And tell us down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read everyone. Now, back to Emmett and the trees, and the 3 payments he was about to miss on purpose. The Kohls had been on that ground since 1889, when Emmett's great-grandfather broke the first sod with a walking plow and a team of oxen and a homestead certificate that still hung, glass cracked, in the front hall. 5 generations, 640 acres of Nebraska loess, rolling and fine and easy to lose in a hard wind. They ran corn and milo and a small herd of black baldy cattle, and in the good decades they'd done fine, and in the bad ones they'd hung on the way the land itself hung on. By not letting go, Emmett was the quiet one. Always had been. His brother Leon had the mouth and moved to Omaha to sell insurance, and Emmett stayed and married a schoolteacher named Ruth and farmed. He watched more than he spoke. He'd stand at the edge of a field for 20 minutes doing nothing a stranger could see, reading the way the water ran and where the topsoil thinned to yellow clay on the ridges. And then he'd go do something about it and never say why. He wasn't a warm man. He forgot birthdays. He could be hard on his boy. But he paid attention, and out there attention is a kind of love. Where the idea came from was his grandfather. Albert Kohl had been a young man during the dirty 30s, and in 1935 he'd signed on with the government tree crews under the Prairie States Forestry Project, the great shelterbelt scheme Roosevelt sent across the plains when the topsoil was blowing all the way to Washington. From the Dakotas down to the Texas Panhandle, those crews planted something near 200 million trees in belts to break the wind. Most folks thought it was a fool's errand then, too. Albert didn't. He came home talking about it the rest of his life, and he kept the bulletin, a thin, soft government pamphlet, USDA, foxed brown at the corners, the staples rusted through. Possible shelterbelt planting in the Plains region. Emmett found it as a boy in a cigar box in the machine shed, and read it so many times the folds went to felt. He kept it in the truck. He had it that April morning on the bench seat next to the seedlings. Now here is what that pamphlet knew, and what the men laughing at the bank did not. A windbreak is not decoration. A row of trees standing across the prevailing wind slows that wind for a distance downwind of 10 to 20 times its own height. Slow the wind, and you slow everything the wind steals. You slow the way it lifts loose soil off bare ground. You slow how fast it dries the crop in the dirt, because moving air pulls water out of soil and leaf like a wick, and still air does not. In winter, a good belt catches the snow that would otherwise scour past to the next county, and lays it down in a long drift on the field. And that snow melts slow in spring, and soaks straight down into the ground as stored water. right where the roots will want it in July. And there was the second half of what Emmett was doing, the half nobody could see from the road. He'd stopped ploughing. He bought a used no-till drill at a farm sale for less than the price of the trees, and he started leaving last year's stalks lying on the ground instead of turning them under. Every year that residue rots down into the soil and builds what a soil man calls organic matter, the dark, crumbly life in dirt. And here is the number that mattered. For every single % you raise the organic matter in an acre of ground, that acre can hold close to 20,000 more gallons of water. It holds rain like a sponge instead of shedding it like a roof, trees to keep the wind from stealing it, bare stalks and no plough to help the ground drink it and keep it. That was the whole plan. Slow, invisible, and years from paying a dime. The bank did not lend money for years from now. The bank lent money for this fall. So in the summer and fall of 1984, Emmett Kohl let 3 loan payments come due, and he did not pay them. Not because he couldn't, he had the cash. He chose the trees and the drill and the seed for a cover crop instead, and he let the payments lapse, and he ate the penalties, and he told no one why. Dale Ferris, the loan officer, a decent enough man of about 40, in a short-sleeved dress shirt, called out to the place and stood in the yard with a folder and asked him, plain, if he was in trouble. "No," Emmett said. "Then I don't understand." Emmett looked at the tree line for a while. "You will," he said. He didn't explain himself. That was his way. It did not go smooth. Nothing worth doing does. That first summer, the drought of the seedlings was near total. The wind and heat took better than half of them before they rooted, and the row along the north fence stood gap-toothed and pitiful brown sticks in the sun. Ruth found him out there one evening, not saying anything, just looking at what had died. The next spring he ordered more and replanted every gap, on his knees again, saying nothing. Then the cattle got through a downed section of fence in the fall of '85 and browsed a good 100 yards of the young ash down to nubs before he found them. He fixed the fence. He caged the trees with wire he cut and bent by hand, one cage at a time in the cold, and replanted what the cattle had killed. Then in the spring of '86, a late ice storm came through and split the leaders out of the tallest cedars, the ones that had finally gotten some height, and set the whole belt back 2 full years in a single night. He walked the line the morning after in the dripping quiet, and Buck Terrell happened by and asked, was he going to give it up now? No, Emmett said. That was the whole conversation. He got the pruning saw and started cleaning up the breaks. The summer of 1988 came in hot and stayed hot. By June, the old-timers were uneasy. Vern Halsey, 79, who'd farmed his whole life before his knees quit and now mostly sat on the co-op bench, kept looking at the sky and not liking it. The meadowlarks went quiet early. The cattle started bunching in the low corners in the middle of the day and wouldn't graze, and the barn swallows flew low and strange, and the evening sky over the sandhills to the north turned, more than one night, the color of old brass. Vern told the boys at the co-op it reminded him of a year he didn't want to name. It didn't rain in June. It didn't rain in July. That summer of 1988 became one of the worst droughts the country had seen in 50 years, tens of billions of dollars gone. The corn burning up, standing in the field from Nebraska to Ohio. In Custer County, the ground cracked open wide enough to lose a boot. The corn on the open quarters rolled its leaves tight as cigars by 10 in the morning and never came back. And then the wind came, the way it always comes to finished ground, and lifted the dry topsoil off the ploughed fields and carried it down the roads in brown curtains. And folks shut their windows in July. Buck Terrell lost his whole East 80. The Peterson place to the west was a write-off by August. All up and down that gravel road, the fields went from green to grey to gone. Emmett Kohl's did not. You could see the line from a mile off. On his side of the fence, in the long shelter of a windbreak that finally, after 4 hard years, stood higher than a man on a horse, the corn was still standing green. Not lush, nothing was lush that year, but green and tasseled and alive, drinking on the snowmelt he'd banked all winter and the rain from 2 years back that his spongy, unploughed ground had held onto when everyone else's had run off. The soil between the rows was cool and dark and covered. When the wind screamed down that road, it hit his tree line and lay down like a whipped dog, and went still over his field, and his dirt stayed where it was, and his crop kept the water it had. It was the only green quarter section between Broken Bow and the county line. Dale Ferris came out in the 3rd week of August. He had a county appraiser with him and a folder thicker than the one from '84. Because Emmett Kohl was on a list now, a list of places the bank was moving to foreclose, and the numbers on the paper said the collateral wasn't worth the note. That paperwork had been drawn up in a cool office in town, off of old plat maps and old yields, and it said this ground was finished, same as the rest. Then Dale Ferris got out of the car and looked at the field. He stood at the fence a long time. The appraiser walked out into the standing corn and walked back and said something low and started crossing things out. The number they'd driven out with didn't hold. It couldn't. You cannot foreclose on the most valuable dirt in the county and call it distressed. And every figure in that folder had been built on the idea that Emmett's ground was worth what Buck's ruined ground was worth. And it wasn't, not even close. The whole case cracked right there at the fence line in the heat. The paper said one thing. The field said another. The field won. Dale Ferris took his hat off. He was not an old man, and he was not a farmer, but he'd been raised out here and he knew what he was looking at. I was wrong, he said. That was all. Nobody made a speech about it. Emmett nodded once, and the two of them stood looking at the corn. And after a while, Ferris put the folder back in the car and drove to town and never brought the foreclosure. The trees had made the payment after all, just not on the bank's calendar. The next spring it started, nobody announced it. There was no meeting, but that fall Buck Terrell drove over one evening and stood at the fence and asked Emmett, quiet, where a man might get seedlings, and how deep you set them, and whether it was too late for a fella his age to bother. Emmett told him. He gave him the name of the nursery and the spacing off the old pamphlet and lent him the wire bender. By 1990, there were 3 new windbreaks going in along that road, and then more the year after. And men who'd laughed in '84 were on their knees in the dirt, setting out sticks and not explaining themselves to the ones who laughed at them. It just spread. The way useful things do. Masanobu Fukuoka, the Japanese farmer who spent his life learning to do less and grow more, once wrote that the ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. And I think about Emmett Kohl on his knees in that cold April wind, planting a thing he might not live to sit under, and I think the corn was never really the harvest. The harvest was the patience. It was the willingness to be laughed at for 4 years and keep replanting the gaps. It was paying attention to what everybody else drove past, an old brown pamphlet in a cigar box, the way the wind pulls the water out of the ground, and trusting it enough to bet the whole farm and say nothing. That's the crop that lasts. That's the one that spreads to the neighbors. He never did make a speech about any of it. When his grandson asked him years later why he'd risked the place on a row of trees, Emmett thought about it a good long while. Ground was worth keeping, he said. That was enough. Have you ever been doubted for doing the slow, right thing while everyone around you took the fast, easy one? Have you ever kept faith in something nobody else could see yet? Tell me about it down in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight, because we read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe and stay with us here for more true-to-life stories of quiet people and the land that remembers them.